I never imagined that an old photograph could unsettle me so deeply. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of the Ashford Historical Society's archive, a black and white image of a sprawling cityscape from the late 1800s. The buildings were grand. Stone facades, towering spires, wide cobblestone streets that stretched into the distance, and perfectly symmetrical squares. You'd expect a bustling crowd, horse-drawn carriages rattling by, shopkeepers hawking their wares, children playing in the streets. Instead, there was almost nothing, just one or two tiny figures here and there, dwarfed by the size of the empty city around them. No smoke curled from the chimneys, no signs of life or warmth inside those stately homes. It was like a ghost town frozen in time. I squinted, wondering if the street lamps were lit or if a horse had been cropped out by accident. Nope, just silence. It felt like someone had paused the world and walked away. I'm James Carter, by the way, a history buff from the little town of Wilsford, nestled in the English countryside. I've always been fascinated by the Victorian era, the explosion of industry, the rise of cities, and all the stories that shaped modern Britain. But this photograph was different. It wasn't just a snapshot, it was a question. Why would such a magnificent city be utterly empty? I dug deeper. The archive held more photos, dozens of them, each showing different cities across England and even America. The same eerie emptiness. Grand cathedrals, stately government buildings, endless rows of houses, all pristine but lifeless. Official accounts chalked it up to early photography limitations, or perhaps the timing of the shots. But come on, if you're going to take a picture of a city, wouldn't you wait until the streets were alive? It felt like the opposite. Almost like these cities were abandoned overnight, yet perfectly preserved. I joked to myself, maybe it's the world's first urban ghost story. Who needs haunted houses when your entire city is a specter? But beneath the humor, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. And then there's the other piece that didn't fit this puzzle, the orphanages. In the same period, thousands upon thousands of orphans seemed to flood the records. Not just a few here and there, but whole institutions springing up in every corner of the country and beyond. In London alone, some orphanages housed over 4,000 children, and there were dozens of such places. Where were all these children coming from? Wars, diseases, industrial accidents. They explained some losses, sure, but the numbers were astronomical. It was like a tidal wave of lost childhoods washing over the world. I started to wonder if these two mysteries were connected. Empty cities crying out for residents and an endless supply of parentless children needing homes. What if these orphans weren't just victims, but part of a much larger, darker story? A story where the past wasn't just forgotten, it was rewritten. As I stared at the photograph, a chill crept down my spine. Somewhere in the shadows of history, there was a secret, one that could change everything we think we know about the 19th century, and I was about to uncover it. The more I researched, the stranger the story became. I found records of orphanages, not just in England, but scattered throughout the United States, Australia, even parts of Europe. It was like a web spun across the globe, connecting thousands of institutions that seemed to appear overnight, each bursting at the seams with children who had no past, no family, no history, and their sheer numbers were staggering. One afternoon, while sifting through old newspapers in a cramped library in the Midlands, I stumbled across a curious article about a man named Martin Collins. According to the paper, he was a celebrated figure, hailed as a pioneer in child welfare. He organized traveling exhibitions where premature babies were cared for in glass incubators set up at fairs and amusement parks. Visitors would pay a small fee to see these tiny lives fighting to survive, all under bright carnival lights and the scent of popcorn and candy floss. I blinked. It sounded less like charity and more like a bizarre sideshow. Imagine strolling through a bustling Victorian fair, your hands sticky from toffee, when you come upon a display of premature infants in glass boxes, with nurses in crisp white uniforms tending them as if they were rare curiosities. Somewhere between a medical marvel and a carnival attraction, these exhibits blurred the line between care and spectacle. I half joked to myself, well, if you thought the circus was all about clowns and lions, welcome to the Baby Incubator show, where the main act is tiny humans in glass cages. Bet the cotton candy doesn't look so sweet now. But the reality was even more unsettling. These exhibitions coincided with the rise of eugenics fairs, dark gatherings promoting the so-called science of improving the human race by selective breeding. In one town, I found an old program advertising both the Incubator Pavilion and an eugenics symposium side by side, like a twisted pairing of hope and horror. Collins reportedly saved over 80,000 infants this way. But where did all these babies come from? Could America's population have produced so many fragile infants, abandoned by their parents, to fill these glass boxes? Or was there something more sinister at play? The idea that children were being displayed as objects, evaluated, measured, and perhaps traded, slowly settled like a stone in my stomach. Digging deeper, I found letters and journals hinting at an underground market. Not openly discussed, but whispered in the margins of social reform debates. Children weren't just saved, they were commodities, parts of a sprawling system that treated human life as inventory. I thought about the empty cities again. Could these children have been shipped off to repopulate those vast, silent streets? Was this spectacle just the public face of a much darker commerce hidden beneath the surface? As I closed the brittle newspaper and rubbed my tired eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was staring down a rabbit hole far deeper than I'd ever imagined. Somewhere, buried in the shadows of history, the truth was waiting, or maybe watching me, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to find it. The next lead came from a dusty box of postcards I uncovered in a small antique shop tucked away in the heart of Canterbury. The shop was cramped, smelling of old paper and lavender, run by a sprightly old woman named Mrs. Whitaker, who claimed she'd never met a history enthusiast like me before. When I showed her the strange photos and told her about the orphan exhibitions, her eyes twinkled with a mix of curiosity and unease. She handed me a bundle of postcards from the early 1900s, each one more peculiar than the last. At first glance, they looked like innocent Victorian-era whimsy. Babies nestled in cabbage patches, infants floating on lily pads, or being delivered by storks wearing postman's caps. But the more I studied them, the more surreal and sinister they became. One card showed a baby perched atop a giant mushroom, smiling innocently, with the caption, "Freshly harvested and ready for new homes." Another depicted a line of infants riding in tiny baskets dangling from airships, the words "Next delivery scheduled" printed in neat script below. There was even a scene of children locked inside cages, like exotic pets on display, with the chilling phrase "Children for sale" scrawled beneath. I blinked, half expecting the babies to start winking at me or to burst into song. Instead, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Here was a hidden language, a silent code wrapped in pastel colors and playful images, but with a message that was anything but innocent. I joked aloud to Mrs. Whitaker, if only Alice in Wonderland had postcards like these, maybe she'd have been more suspicious of that Mad Hatter. She chuckled nervously but didn't disagree. What made these cards all the more disturbing was a recurring phrase printed in French. À vendre. For sale. No metaphor. No joke. A blunt advertisement camouflaged in the guise of children's stories. Why would such a grim message be wrapped in whimsical imagery? Was this some kind of code used by those involved in this shadowy trade? And how widely was it known? The postcards came from France, the UK, Germany, and even the United States, suggesting this wasn't a local oddity, but an international phenomenon. As I flipped through the cards, I noticed some babies had little resumes attached. Cheerful, obedient, no bedwetting, or affectionate and easy to care for. It was like browsing a catalog for furniture or livestock rather than human beings. The idea was so grotesque I had to laugh, partly to keep my sanity. Well, I suppose if you're shopping for a child, you'd want to know if they come with a warranty or free returns. I muttered dryly, but the cards were clear. No returns accepted. That night, lying awake in my flat overlooking the quiet streets of Wilsford, I couldn't shake the feeling that these postcards were pieces of a much larger, darker puzzle. A global system that treated children not as souls to be cherished, but as products to be grown, packaged, and sold. And in the distance, those empty cities loomed in my mind's eye, waiting for their new inhabitants. But what kind of world were we really inheriting? The following week, I found myself on a rattling train bound for Nottingham, chasing a lead that promised to shed more light on this tangled web. The town's old records office held detailed logs of the so-called orphan trains, a social experiment run from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, where hundreds of thousands of children were shipped from overcrowded eastern cities to rural communities in the Midlands and beyond. The official story was noble: save destitute children, give them homes on farms, help build a better future. But the sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Over 200,000 children moved like cargo, packed into wooden boxcars and sent off to strangers who might or might not care for them. As I leafed through the records, the language was clinical and detached, eerily devoid of emotion. Children were assigned numbers, grouped by age and health, and notes were made about their disposability. I cursed under my breath. Disposability. What is this, a shipment of potatoes? I half expected to see "handle with care" stamped on the margins. What struck me most was the lack of follow-up. Once these children were delivered, their fates vanished into obscurity. No record of adoption success stories, no trace of their lives afterward. It was as if they were meant to disappear into the landscape, filling the empty houses and streets I'd seen in those old photographs. I took a walk through Nottingham's outskirts where the trains once unloaded their precious cargo. The fields were quiet now, but I imagined the clatter of iron wheels and the nervous faces of children stepping off into unknown futures. The houses looked too neat, too empty, ghostly echoes of lives that might have been. Later, I stumbled upon a small museum dedicated to the Industrial Revolution. Among the exhibits was a faded photograph of a grand orphanage, its iron gates open wide, the children lined up in crisp uniforms. One girl, no older than 8, stared directly at the camera, her eyes a mix of hope and fear. Something about her gaze unsettled me, as if she knew the truth behind those walls. That evening, I met with a local historian, Claire Bennett, a sharp woman with keen eyes and a sharp wit. She listened intently as I recounted my findings, then sighed. "James, you're poking at a wound that history has long tried to cover up," she said, lighting a cigarette with a practiced flick. "The orphan trains weren't just charity. They were part of a larger plan, a repopulation scheme after some event no one wants to name." I raised an eyebrow. "A plan? Like what? A post-apocalyptic England?" Claire shrugged. "Something like that. The theory goes that those empty cities weren't empty by accident. They needed people. Orphans were the easiest to move, the easiest to control. They were the building blocks of a new society." I laughed bitterly. "So, we're talking about human livestock?" She nodded solemnly. "And don't forget the postcards, the exhibitions, the incubators. It was a system, ripe with exploitation and secrecy." As I left Nottingham that night, the sky heavy with rain, I realized I was no longer chasing a mere historical curiosity. I was unraveling a conspiracy so vast and dark, it threatened to rewrite everything we thought we knew about our past. And somewhere in the shadows, the children of those empty cities were waiting for what I still didn't know. After Nottingham, my next stop was Brighton, a seaside town that, on the surface, seemed worlds away from the grim orphan trains and ghost cities. But beneath its cheerful facade, I found another piece of the puzzle that chilled me to the bone. I was drawn to the Royal Pavilion, that extravagant palace built by King George III, all swirling domes and ornate spires. It was a place of opulence, excess, and, as it turned out, dark secrets. In the pavilion's archives, I discovered records of traveling exhibitions run by a man named Martin Collins, the very same figure I'd read about in those carnival tales. Collins had set up glass incubators at seaside fairs, turning the care of premature babies into a public spectacle. Visitors paid a shilling to peer into the glass boxes, watching fragile infants struggle to survive, all while the carousel spun nearby and vendors hawked candy apples. Nurses in starched white uniforms moved among the crowds, tending to the babies as if they were part of the show. I imagined the scene. Children, barely more than whispers of life, displayed like exotic curiosities, while families enjoyed the amusements. A strange mix of hope and horror hung in the salty air. Flipping through dusty ledgers, I found entries listing thousands of infants, many born in unknown circumstances, often abandoned, sometimes simply unclaimed. The numbers were staggering, and the records hinted at sales, transfers, even exchanges between institutions. One ledger page was marked with a chilling note: "No returns accepted." I smirked bitterly. Well, I suppose if you're shopping for a baby at the fair, you better be certain. No refunds, no exchanges, no warranties. But the joke felt hollow. These were lives, not merchandise. I sought out descendants of families who had attended these fairs, hoping to find personal stories. Most had only vague memories, tinged with embarrassment or denial. One elderly woman recalled her grandmother mentioning the baby show with a nervous laugh, as if it were something too strange to fully grasp. That night I walked along Brighton's pebbled beach, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore. The carnival lights flickered in the distance, and I could almost hear the faint echo of children's laughter mingled with the hum of gas lamps and carousel music. I thought about those fragile infants, displayed like trophies, their fates tied to a system that commodified human life. And I wondered, if this was the public face, what horrors lay hidden behind the scenes? As I gazed out over the dark sea, a storm was gathering on the horizon. It wasn't just the weather that threatened to break. It was the truth, and I was caught in the eye of it. The storm hit Brighton with a vengeance the next morning, pounding rain and fierce wind rattling the windows of the small inn where I'd stayed. I welcomed the tempest. It seemed fitting, as if the weather itself was echoing the turmoil swirling inside me. The pieces of this dark puzzle were coming together, but the full picture remained maddeningly elusive. I found refuge in the town's modest library, its oak shelves heavy with dust and secrets. There, buried among forgotten ledgers and faded newspapers, I uncovered something that made my blood run cold. References to repopulation contracts signed by local officials and orphanage administrators. These documents weren't just about care or adoption. They detailed the deliberate relocation and settlement of orphan children in specific regions, often far from their birthplaces. One contract outlined the transfer of nearly 500 children from overcrowded London institutions to fledgling towns in northern England. The language was clinical, but the implications were horrific. Children treated like stock, moved to fill a demographic void. I jotted down the names and dates, noticing a pattern that matched the empty city photographs and the orphan train routes. It was as if these children were the bricks and mortar of a grand, calculated plan to rebuild civilization from the ashes. But why? What catastrophe had emptied those cities? What event had wiped out entire populations, leaving behind silent streets and vacant homes? My mind raced back to the postcards, the surreal images of babies emerging from cabbage patches and arriving by airships and storks. The folklore of storks delivering babies suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Were these fairy tales not innocent stories, but coded messages about a vast logistics network for human distribution? I couldn't shake the image of those children locked in cages, their eyes haunted and desperate. What kind of world had turned human lives into commodities? As the rain eased, I stepped outside and wandered toward Brighton's old pier, its wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. The sea stretched endlessly before me, gray and unforgiving. Somewhere beneath those waves, the past was buried, dark secrets waiting to resurface. I pulled my coat tighter against the damp chill and thought about the next piece of this grim puzzle. There was talk among historians of postcard collectors who had stumbled upon entire collections of these disturbing images, but no one had pieced them together into a coherent story. I had to find them. If these postcards were the key to unlocking the truth, I needed to follow their trail, across towns, across countries, across oceans. And I had a sinking feeling that the closer I got, the more dangerous this quest would become, because some secrets were meant to stay buried. But I wasn't about to turn back. Not now. I caught the early morning train from Brighton to Cambridge, a city famed for its ancient colleges and scholarly minds. It seemed the perfect place to hunt for clues buried in academic archives, where dusty manuscripts and forgotten correspondences might shed light on the tangled web I was unraveling. At the university library, I was granted access to a restricted collection of letters and diaries from social reformers and medical pioneers, of the late 19th century. Among them, I found the personal journals of Dr. Henry Whitmore, a controversial figure who had worked closely with Martin Collins. Whitmore's entries were a stark contrast to the polished official reports, raw, candid, and chilling. He wrote about the increasing number of premature infants born in London's slums, many abandoned or left to die. But more disturbingly, he hinted at a systematic cultivation of children, an industrial-scale operation where infants were not just saved, but bred and prepared for a new society. The language was clinical, but the implications were horrifying. These children were resources, products, even investments in a future civilization. One passage made my breath catch. The exhibitions serve a dual purpose. They not only preserve life but accustom the public to the commodification of children. It is necessary for the acceptance of the coming order. I shuddered. This wasn't charity or medicine. It was conditioning, a step toward normalizing the idea that children could be owned, traded, and controlled like any other asset. Whitmore's writings also mentioned coded correspondence between orphanage administrators across Europe and America, referencing deliveries, quality assessments, and repopulation quotas. The very same language I'd seen on those eerie postcards. As I pored over the documents, I felt a growing sense of dread. This was no isolated scandal. It was an orchestrated global operation with far-reaching consequences. In one letter, Whitmore described a secret meeting held at a grand estate outside London, where influential figures discussed the Great Reset of society. Their goal was to rebuild civilization from the ruins of a forgotten catastrophe, using these children as the foundation. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The truth I was uncovering was monstrous, an engineered rebirth of humanity, built on the backs of countless lost lives. Walking through the ancient courtyards of Cambridge, I caught sight of a young woman in a flowing emerald dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall. She paused to adjust a delicate silver necklace shaped like a key, a symbol I'd seen before, etched faintly on one of the postcards. Our eyes met briefly, and a flicker of recognition passed between us. Before I could speak, she vanished into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers. The mystery was deepening, and I was entangled in a web far beyond anything I'd imagined. Somewhere in this city of scholars and secrets, the next piece of the puzzle was waiting, but time was running out. That fleeting encounter with the woman in emerald haunted me more than I expected. Her presence felt like a whispered warning, a sign that I was no longer just an observer, but part of something much larger, perhaps even dangerous. Determined to find answers, I began to follow the faint trail she left behind. I tracked down a local historian named Edward Mason, a man known for his obsession with cryptic Victorian symbols and secret societies. His cluttered study was filled with old books, faded maps, and peculiar artifacts. When I showed him the postcards and the key-shaped necklace, his eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and dread. "Ah, the Key Society," he murmured, running his fingers over a dusty leather-bound tome. A shadowy group rumored to have influenced social reforms, eugenics, and even the orphan relocation programs. Their symbol was a key, signifying control and access to, well, secrets best left hidden. Edward explained that the society was believed to have orchestrated much of the dark underbelly of the 19th century's Great Reset. They operated behind the scenes, manipulating public perception through exhibitions, propaganda, and even the surreal postcards I'd uncovered. He handed me a faded map marked with obscure locations, abandoned towns, old orphanages, and fairgrounds across England and beyond. Many places corresponded with the empty city photographs and orphan train routes. One location stood out, an old manor house near Wilsford, my hometown. According to Edward, it had once been a meeting place for the Key Society, now long deserted, but rumored to hold hidden archives. I couldn't resist the pull of that familiar name. Returning to Wilsford felt like stepping into a shadow of my own past, a place where childhood memories mingled with the secrets I was unraveling. Under a moonless sky, I made my way to the manor, its silhouette looming like a sleeping giant against the night. The iron gates groaned as I pushed them open, and the cold air wrapped around me like a shroud. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of dust and decay, But in the library behind a false panel, I discovered a trove of letters, journals, and photographs. Evidence of the society's involvement in orchestrating the orphan migrations, the exhibitions, and even the postcard campaigns. Among the papers was a chilling manifesto outlining plans for a controlled repopulation of the world, using children as pawns in a grand social experiment. As I read, the manor seemed to breathe around me, its walls whispering secrets long buried. A sudden noise echoed through the hall, a door creaking open somewhere in the darkness. I wasn't alone, and whatever was coming for me knew exactly who I was. The creaking door echoed through the manor like a gunshot, slicing through the heavy silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the fragile manifesto tighter, every instinct screaming at me to run. But curiosity, stubborn and reckless, rooted me to the spot. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in black, face obscured by the flickering candlelight. The air grew colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, edged with warning and something darker, authority. "I'm just looking for the truth," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the tremor threatening to betray me. The figure stepped closer, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "Some truths are meant to stay buried. The past is a dangerous thing, James. Uncovering it could put more than your life at risk." I swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling like lead. What happened? Why were those cities emptied? Why did millions of children vanish into this system? A bitter smile flickered. A catastrophe they erased from history. The Great Collapse. An event so devastating it shattered societies. The key society's Great Reset was their attempt to rebuild order at any cost. The figure paused, then reached into their cloak, producing an old weathered postcard, the same surreal imagery I'd seen before. These images were never innocent. They were signals, contracts, and warnings. Each child cataloged, traded, and placed where they were needed. I stepped back, the room spinning, and the children. What became of them? Some became the foundation of new towns, new families. Others were lost to darker fates. The system was ruthless. Efficiency over compassion, a world reconstructed on silence and sacrifice. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving hurriedly. The figure's eyes darted toward the stairs. "We need to go. They're coming." I followed them through twisting corridors, the weight of the manifesto burning in my pocket. As we burst through the back door into the night, the manor seemed to shudder behind us, as if protesting our escape. Breathless, the figure finally spoke their name. "Evelyn." "We're both part of this story now," she said, her gaze fierce, "and the next chapter is just beginning." As we vanished into the dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest secret was still waiting, hidden in plain sight, ready to rewrite everything I thought I knew about the past. But one thing was certain, I was no longer just an observer. I was a player in a game far bigger and darker than I ever imagined, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of humanity itself. Days later, safe, at least for the moment, in a cramped flat on the outskirts of Oxford, Evelyn and I pored over every scrap of evidence we'd gathered. The manifesto, the postcards, the orphan train records, and the key society's secret correspondences formed a tapestry both vast and terrifying. The Great Collapse wasn't just a theory anymore. Somewhere buried beneath layers of sanitized history and official silence lay the truth of a global catastrophe that had wiped out entire populations, leaving cities as empty shells and millions of children orphaned overnight. But what haunted me most was the realization that those children, the very foundation of our modern world, had been treated as commodities, grown, cataloged, and distributed like livestock. The chilling marketplace of human life, disguised beneath layers of whimsy and folklore, was a grotesque shadow of our shared past. Evelyn traced a finger over the faded postcard of a baby nestled in a cabbage patch. The myths we laughed off, storks, cabbages, mushrooms, they weren't just stories, they were coded language, a cover-up so deep that it became folklore. I nodded, heart heavy, and the postcards were the catalogs, The advertisements for a new generation sold to the highest bidder. It's monstrous. Outside, the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. A sudden knock at the door jolted us both. I glanced at Evelyn, her eyes sharp, wary. I opened the door to find a plain envelope resting on the welcome mat. No sender, no return address. Inside was a single postcard, one I hadn't seen before. It depicted a swirling black vortex swallowing a city skyline, with the words scrawled beneath in shaky handwriting. The reset is not over. A cold dread settled over me. Whoever sent this knew exactly where we were, and what we'd uncovered. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. This isn't just history, it's happening again. As darkness fell, I realized our journey was far from over. The past had reached out across time, dragging us into a shadow war between forgotten truths and those desperate to keep them buried. And somewhere, hidden within the ruins of empty cities and whispered legends, the next chapter awaited, one that could change everything. The Great Reset was not a thing of the past. It was only beginning.